So, Father Dan, the Pope signaled out four Americans, two of them being Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., but also Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Now, we know that they're beloved Catholics, but they're also controversial Catholics. Why do you think Pope Francis chose Thomas Merton?
Of all the various American Catholics he could have cited, I think these two are somewhat obscure to a large variety of the Catholic Christian community. I think one of the clues as to why Pope Francis would have picked Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton appears in the quote that he uses from Thomas Merton's Seven Story Mountain, his spiritual autobiography, in which he acknowledges that, at least in Thomas Merton's voice, that he's both created holy and good, but also a sinner, somebody who struggled with his humanity, that he was a very ordinary person. And I think that both Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton represent ordinary Christian living, discipleship, people who try to live the gospel and acknowledge their own frailty and weakness along the way.
Now, as you said, he could have chosen several notable Catholic Americans, but he mentioned the two who have been in trouble with the church at different points in their lives. So Day was told not to use the word Catholic, and Merton was silenced by his superiors for writing against the Vietnam and the Cold War. Do you think that this was significant in itself?
I do. I think saying that they were in trouble with the church may be a little bit misleading, although some people certainly hold that opinion, that perspective, which is why they're somewhat controversial figures. I think one of the reasons that Pope Francis pointed to them is precisely because, in one point, he mentions with regard to Thomas Merton that he was a man who was not afraid to challenge the certitudes of his time. Which means that he was not afraid, like the prophets in the Old Testament, for instance, or of Jesus in the Gospels, of pointing out injustices where they existed and highlighting how the gospel isn't being lived in our own time. And asking these kind of questions tend to make people uncomfortable.
And now we know they're both very nonviolent Americans, and that fits the Pope's call to end the arms race. But do you think that saying this in front of Congress, that this shows the Pope himself to be a radical, that he's aligning himself with radicals? What's your opinion?
I think so, but maybe not in the way that a lot of people would anticipate. I think Pope Francis is incredibly radical, but in the original meaning of the word, which comes from the word radix in Latin, or root. He's calling us by his actions and by his words, by his address to Congress and all the homilies that he gave and talks. He's calling us to go back to the roots of our faith, to the root of the gospel. And what he does in terms of embracing all sorts of people from all walks of life, in terms of calling for reconciliation, peacemaking, bridge building, by pointing to people like Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, what he's really doing is giving us a lived example and model of Christian living.